June 17, 1462. A prince with 10,000 men rode straight into a camp of 90,000 Ottoman soldiers, in total darkness, with one goal: kill the most powerful man on earth before sunrise. He got close enough to see the Sultan's face. That prince was Vlad III of Wallachia, the man the world would later call Dracula. But before you understand what happened that night, before you understand how one ruler nearly decapitated an empire with a single cavalry charge, you need to understand what was marching toward him. Because the army that crossed the Danube in the spring of 1462 wasn't just large. It was the largest military force that had moved through southeastern Europe in living memory. And the man leading it had already achieved the impossible once before. So let's go back. A few weeks before that night. To the river. The Danube smelled like thawing earth that spring. Dark. Mineral. Ancient. As if the water itself carried the memory of every army that had ever waded through its current. Along the southern bank, the grass bent flat under a procession that didn't look like an army. It looked like a nation on the move. 90,000 men. Stretched in a column so long that from the hills on the opposite shore, you couldn't see where it ended. Cavalry outriders swept across the floodplain in disciplined arcs. Their horses were bred on the steppe. Broken for war. Behind them came the infantry. Block after block after block. Soldiers drawn from every corner of an empire that now reached from the Euphrates River to the coast of the Adriatic Sea. Sipahi horsemen in glinting chainmail. Azab irregulars, landless men carrying the kind of hunger that makes soldiers dangerous. Engineers hauling siege equipment on carts that groaned under the weight of bronze cannon. 120 of them. Enough to reduce any fortress in Europe to rubble. And at the center of this tide, the core, the heartbeat, marched the Janissaries. You need to stop and understand what that word meant in 1462. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were born Christian. Taken as boys from their families across the Balkans through a system called the Devshirme. Converted to Islam. Trained from childhood in a military discipline so intense it had no parallel anywhere in the world. They owned no land. They had no families. They had no loyalty except to the Sultan. They were weapons shaped like men. 9 years earlier, these same Janissaries had done something the world believed was impossible. They had breached the walls of Constantinople. Walls that had held for over 1,000 years. They had poured through the shattered gate of St. Romanus while the last Roman emperor died fighting in the rubble, his body never identified, his empire erased in an afternoon. Now they marched north again. Same discipline. Same silence. Same unhurried certainty of men who had already conquered the unconquerable. If you're watching this and you think you know where this story goes, you don't. Hit subscribe right now. Because what this army walked into would shake the Ottoman Empire to its foundations, and the man who did it used nothing but fire, darkness, and a level of brutality that still haunts the region 500 years later. At the head of this column rode Sultan Mehmed II. 29 years old. Already the most accomplished conqueror of his generation. Possibly any generation. His resume was the kind of thing that sounded exaggerated until you checked the sources. He had taken Constantinople at the age of 21, the city that had defied Islamic conquest for 8 centuries. 14 generations of Ottoman sultans had dreamed of it. He did it. Then he renamed it Istanbul, rebuilt it, and made it the jewel of an empire that was growing faster than any power since Rome. He had broken Venice's grip on the Aegean Sea. Humbled Serbia. forced the princes of the Morea to kneel and hand over their territories. His court in Edirne was the most sophisticated in the world, scholars, artists, engineers, all drawn to the gravity of a man who didn't just conquer cities but redesigned them. But here's what made this campaign different from every conquest before it. Mehmed wasn't riding north to expand his empire. He was riding north to punish someone. Someone who had committed an act so brazen, so deliberately provocative, that every diplomat in Constantinople had gone silent when the news arrived. The ruler of Wallachia, a vassal state, a footnote on Ottoman maps, had killed Mehmed's envoys. Not imprisoned them. Not sent them home with a warning. Killed them. And then done something worse. He had taken their bodies and driven wooden stakes through them. Planted those stakes along the road to the city of Giurgiu. Then, and this is the detail that crossed the line from rebellion into insult, he had taken the envoys' turbans and nailed them to their skulls. With iron nails. Hammered through cloth and bone. In Ottoman culture, the turban was sacred. A symbol of faith. Of identity. Nailing it to a dead man's head wasn't just disrespect. It was a message written in a language Mehmed understood perfectly. I am not your vassal. I will never be your vassal. Come and see what that costs. When the news reached Mehmed in Edirne, the court fell silent. Advisors watched the Sultan's face, that broad, intelligent face with heavy-lidded eyes and the sharp nose he shared with his father. It showed nothing. No rage. No shock. Then he spoke one sentence. We will go north. And now the north trembled. But here's what you need to understand about the target. Wallachia was small. So small it could be swallowed whole by a single Ottoman province. On the maps drawn in Constantinople, maps that now showed Ottoman dominion from Persia to Greece, Wallachia was barely a mark. A buffer state wedged between Hungary and the Ottoman frontier. Rolling plains. Thick forests. A population of shepherds and minor nobles. Orthodox Christians who clung to their faith the way drowning men cling to driftwood. It had survived this long for one reason only: it was useful. A buffer between empires. A tributary that paid its annual tax in gold and boys and kept its head down. The Ottomans didn't need to conquer Wallachia. They just needed it to kneel. For decades, it had. Until now. The man who ruled this land, they called him voivode, the Wallachian word for prince, had shattered every expectation. Broken every protocol. And the killing of the envoys wasn't even the beginning. He had already launched raids across the Danube into Ottoman territory. Burned Ottoman settlements. Killed Ottoman subjects. Freed Christian prisoners. He had sent a letter to Mehmed that read less like diplomacy and more like a declaration of war written by someone who had stopped caring whether he lived or died. Mehmed's response was proportional. He didn't send a regiment. He didn't send a division. He sent everything. 90,000 soldiers. The full weight of an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Enough force to wipe Wallachia from the map and salt the earth where it had been. No one in the Ottoman court doubted the outcome. A punitive expedition. Swift. Decisive. The voivode's head on a pike. A loyal puppet installed on the Wallachian throne. A lesson delivered to every vassal prince in the Balkans: this is what happens when you defy the conqueror. It was a reasonable expectation. The math supported it. The history supported it. Every precedent in Ottoman military strategy supported it. But here's where every prediction broke down. What Mehmed didn't know what nobody in that column of 90,000 understood, was that the man waiting on the other side of the Danube had already been inside the empire. Not as a spy. As a prisoner. He had spent 4 years as a hostage in the Sultan's own court. He had been educated alongside Ottoman princes. He had learned their language. Studied their tactics. Memorized their weaknesses. He knew exactly how the machine worked. Every gear. Every lever. Every crack in the armor. And he had spent every single day since his release planning how to break it. The Ottoman army had never retreated from a smaller force. Not once in its history. What happened over the next 3 weeks would shatter that record, but not in any way you'd expect. Not through battlefield heroics. Not through some glorious cavalry charge from a Hollywood script. Through something much darker. Through starvation. Through sleeplessness. Through a kind of psychological warfare so extreme that soldiers who had stormed the walls of Constantinople would weep and refuse to march forward. Through a forest of 20,000 dead bodies impaled on wooden stakes, facing south, waiting for the army like a welcome sign written in human flesh. That story starts in a darkened room in a Wallachian monastery. With a man staring at a map. Running numbers he already knew by heart. Preparing to do something so desperate, so savage, and so brilliant that 5 centuries later, historians still argue about what to call it. Madness, some say. Genius, say others. The truth is worse than both. And it begins with a 13-year-old boy being handed over to the enemy as a human guarantee. In a darkened chamber inside the fortified monastery at Snagov, miles from the capital at Târgoviște, a man stood over a table covered in reports that told him nothing he didn't already know. Vlad III. Son of Vlad Dracul, the dragon. 31 years old, though his face carried more years than that. Long angular. Deep-set eyes that seemed to pull light in rather than throw it back. A thick mustache that hung past his jawline in the Wallachian style. His hands were rough. Scarred. Not the hands of a prince who gave orders from a cushioned throne. The hands of a man who had seized power through betrayal, exile, murder, and a will so relentless it bordered on something clinical. He studied the numbers his scouts had delivered. 90,000 troops. 120 cannon. Supply trains stretching 20 miles along the southern roads. He read them the way a doctor reads a diagnosis he already suspected. No surprise. No panic. Just confirmation. He had provoked this. Every move, the raids across the Danube, the burned Ottoman settlements, the freed prisoners, the killed envoys with their turbans nailed to their skulls, all of it had been calculated to produce exactly this response. A full-scale Ottoman invasion. The entire weight of the empire aimed directly at him. His commanders thought he had lost his mind. Some of them said it to his face. Others said it in whispers they assumed wouldn't reach him. They always reached him. But here's the part no one tells you about Vlad III. The cruelty. The impaling. The reputation that would eventually turn him into a monster in Western propaganda and a vampire in fiction. None of it was random. None of it was madness. It was memory. He was 13 when his father sold him. That's the blunt version. The diplomatic version is that Vlad Dracul, his father, sent Vlad and his younger brother Radu to the Ottoman court as hostages. A gesture of loyalty. A guarantee that Wallachia would remain a faithful vassal. The Ottomans demanded it. His father complied. But a 13-year-old boy doesn't understand diplomatic gestures. He understands that his father put him in a cart, sent him across the Danube, and handed him to the enemy. For 4 years, Vlad and Radu lived in Anatolia. Inside the Ottoman machine. They were educated. Taught Turkish. Taught Arabic. Taught the Quran, horsemanship, court protocol, military theory. They ate Ottoman food. Wore Ottoman clothes. Lived under Ottoman guard. It was a gilded cage. Comfortable. Even luxurious by Wallachian standards. But a cage doesn't stop being a cage because the bars are made of gold. Now, here's where you need to pay close attention. Because what Vlad learned during those 4 years wasn't just language. It wasn't just etiquette. It was the Ottoman playbook for swallowing nations whole. And once you understand that playbook, everything Vlad did afterward makes perfect, terrifying sense. The Ottoman Empire didn't always conquer by force. Force was expensive. Messy. It left scars that took generations to heal. The preferred method was slower. Quieter. And far more effective. Step 1, demand tribute. Gold. Grain. Goods. A vassal state pays, and in return, it keeps its ruler, its religion, its language. It feels like a fair deal. It's not. Step 2, request a garrison. Just a small one. For protection, of course. A few hundred soldiers stationed in a border fortress. Hardly noticeable. Except now Ottoman troops are on your soil. Now Ottoman officers are watching your court. Now every decision you make is observed and reported. Step 3, accept the devshirm. The blood tax. Ottoman officials arrive in your villages. They examine your sons, Christian boys, ages 8 to 18. The strongest. The smartest. The healthiest. These boys are taken. Removed from their families. Shipped to Anatolia. Converted to Islam. Their names changed. Their language replaced. Their identities erased. The best of them become janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers. The same men who broke Constantinople's walls. Born Christian. Made Muslim. Turned into the most loyal fighting force the Sultan possessed. Loyal because they had nothing else. No family. No homeland. No past. Only the empire. Step 3 is where nations die. Not with a bang. With a slow, generational fade. Your sons fight for the empire that took them. Your daughters fill Ottoman households. Your nobles learn that cooperation brings rewards and resistance brings ruin. Within 1 generation, the ruling class speaks Turkish. Within 2, the population has shifted. Within 3, your country doesn't exist anymore. Not conquered. Dissolved. Like sugar in hot water. Vlad watched this process from the inside. He saw it working on provinces across the Balkans. He saw the boys arrive, terrified, confused, ripped from their mothers, and he saw what came out the other end. Soldiers with no memory of home. Administrators with no loyalty except to the Sultan. Governors who ruled their own people as foreigners. And then he watched it work on his own brother. Radu was younger. Handsome. Charming in a way Vlad was not. Where Vlad resisted, silently, stubbornly, with a coldness that unsettled his Ottoman handlers, Radu adapted. He learned Turkish fluently. He adopted Ottoman manners with natural grace. He dressed in Ottoman fashion. He smiled at the right moments, laughed at the right jokes, and demonstrated the kind of effortless social intelligence that makes captors forget their prisoner is a prisoner. He became a favorite of young Mehmed himself. The future conqueror of Constantinople and the younger son of the dragon of Wallachia, close companions, perhaps more. The sources are ambiguous, and the truth is less important than the result. Radu became Ottoman. Not officially. Not on paper. But in every way that mattered. His loyalties shifted. His identity softened. His faith, the Orthodox Christianity his family had defended for generations, became negotiable, then optional, then abandoned. He converted to Islam. Not at sword point. By choice. By the slow, comfortable gravitational pull of an empire that knew exactly how to make surrender feel like opportunity. Vlad watched this happen. Day by day. Meal by meal. Conversation by conversation. He watched his own blood become proof that the system worked. And something inside him locked shut. Permanently. If you want to understand every impaled body, every burned village, every act of calculated horror that Vlad would commit for the rest of his life, this is the source. Not madness. Not bloodlust. A 13-year-old boy watching his brother disappear into the machine and deciding, with the kind of clarity that only comes from total powerlessness, that he would become something the empire could not absorb. Could not seduce. Could not soften. Something it could only fear. He was released in 1448, after his father and older brother were murdered, killed by Wallachian boyars with Hungarian backing, their bodies dumped in undignified graves. Vlad was 17. An orphan. A former hostage. A prince without a throne, without allies, without resources. He seized the Wallachian throne briefly that same year. Lost it within months. Was driven into exile. Spent years moving between courts, Moldova, Hungary, learning, watching, waiting. Building the patience that captivity had taught him. He regained the throne in 1456 with Hungarian support. And in the 6 years since, he had ruled with a ferocity that stunned even Wallachia's hardened nobility. He impaled corrupt boyars who had betrayed his father. He burned beggars alive in a locked hall, declaring that in his Wallachia, no man would suffer want, a statement so monstrous in its logic that it defied response. He nailed the hats of foreign ambassadors to their heads for failing to remove them in his presence. Every act was public. Every punishment was visible. Every message was the same: this land answers to one man, and that man does not negotiate. The German-speaking lands to the west were already printing pamphlets about him. Woodcuts showing a mustachioed prince dining among rows of impaled victims. Dipping his bread in their blood. These were propaganda, exaggerated, sensationalized, designed to sell copies in a Europe that had just discovered the printing press. But they were built on a foundation of fact that Vlad never bothered to deny. He didn't care what the West thought. He cared about one thing: making Wallachia strong enough to survive what he knew was coming. Now, standing in the monastery at Snagov, the reports confirmed it. The thing he'd spent 6 years preparing for was here. 90,000 against his 20,000. And his 20,000 were not janissaries. They were farmers who fought because their voivode commanded it. Minor nobles who owed military service. A corps of experienced soldiers hardened by border raids. A handful of mercenaries who would vanish the moment the battle turned. No heavy artillery. No siege engineers. No navy. No supply chain that could sustain a prolonged campaign. And no allies. He had sent appeals to every Christian power that might conceivably help. To King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, the man who had helped him retake the throne, who called himself a defender of Christendom, who sat behind the Carpathian mountains with a fresh army and did nothing. To Venice, which feared Ottoman expansion but feared the cost of war more. To Pope Pius II, who had declared a crusade with great ceremony and zero follow-through. The Pope was old. The Pope was dying. The crusade existed on paper and nowhere else. Every reply came wrapped in sympathy. Every reply was empty of soldiers. Vlad understood something that night that most people never learn, and it's a truth that hasn't changed in 500 years. When you're truly in danger, when the threat is real, when the cost of helping you is high, the only army coming to save you is the one you already have. He looked at his map. He looked at his numbers. He did the math that his commanders had already done and arrived at the same conclusion they had. Conventional war meant annihilation. If he met the Ottoman army in open battle, the kind of battle the Ottomans were designed to win, his 20,000 would be swallowed in an afternoon. Destroyed so completely that there wouldn't be enough survivors to carry the news home. So there would be no conventional war. No pitched battles. No defensive sieges. No glorious last stand on an open field. Instead, there would be something the Ottoman army had never faced before. Something their training hadn't prepared them for. Something their massive numerical advantage couldn't solve. Vlad would turn his own country into a weapon. Every field. Every village. Every road. Every well. Every shadow after dark. He would make Wallachia itself the thing that killed them. But the weapon he chose would cost him something no victory could ever repay. It would cost him his people's homes, their harvest, their security. It would cost him his reputation for centuries. It would cost him, ultimately, his throne and his life. And before it was over, it would require him to do something so horrifying that the soldiers who had stormed Constantinople, men who had seen the worst that war could produce, would weep at the sight of it and refuse to take another step forward. That part comes later. First came the burning. The Ottoman vanguard crossed the Danube at Nicopolis in late May. By the first week of June, the main body was moving north across the Wallachian plain under a sun that got hotter every day. The mood in the column was confident. Almost casual. Mehmed's intelligence report said Vlad's forces were scattered. Disorganized. The capital at Târgoviște was only days ahead. Ottoman war councils projected a timeline measured in weeks, not months. March north. Take the capital. Capture or kill the voivode. Install Radu, Vlad's own brother, loyal, cooperative, Ottoman in everything but blood, as the new ruler. Secure the province. March home before autumn. A punitive expedition. Swift. Clean. Exemplary. The first sign that the plan was wrong came on the second day of the advance. Forward scouts rode into the village of Târnu and found nothing. Not nothing as in, no resistance. Nothing as in the village no longer existed. Every dwelling had been burned to its foundation stones. The granaries were ash. The wells had been filled, not just with rubble, but with the rotting carcasses of dead animals. The stench was suffocating. There was no food to take. No shelter to use. No person to question. The scouts reported back. Mehmed ordered the column forward. The next village was the same. Burned. Emptied. Wells poisoned. The one after that. The same. And the one after that. Vlad had given his people the most terrible order a ruler can give. Destroy everything. Burn the fields before the harvest comes in. Slaughter every head of livestock that can't be driven into the mountains. Poison every water source, every well, every stream crossing, every pond, along the Ottoman army's projected path of advance. Tear down every structure that could provide shade or shelter. Leave nothing. Not a grain of wheat. Not a bucket of clean water. Not a single roof to sleep under. And then disappear. The order had been carried out with the grim discipline of a people who understood what was at stake. Not because they trusted Vlad. Many of them feared him more than they feared the Ottomans. But because they understood the alternative. They had watched what happened to Bulgaria. To Serbia. To the Morea. They had seen the Devshirm convoys pass through neighboring territories, carts full of boys, heading south, never coming back. Families loaded what they could onto carts and drove into the forests. The vast, ancient forests of the Carpathian foothills, forests so deep and so old that entire communities could vanish into them for months without being found. Priests carried icons and holy relics into caves they had used for the same purpose during every invasion for the past 3 centuries. Nobles, men who had spent lifetimes building estates, set fire to their own homes. Stood in their courtyards and watched generations of labor turn to smoke. Mothers carried infants along forest paths where the canopy was so thick that noon looked like dusk. Old men who couldn't keep up were left beside the road with a prayer and a skin of water. Everyone understood what being left behind meant. No one said it out loud. It was an exodus. Entire regions emptied in days. And it was done not in panic, not in the desperate scramble of a civilian population caught off guard, but in cold, rehearsed calculation. Because Vlad had planned this for years. He had studied the Ottoman military machine from the inside. He had eaten its food. Worn its clothes. Listened to its officers discuss logistics over dinner. And he had identified the one vulnerability that no amount of cavalry or cannon could fix. An army of 90,000 men is not a fighting force. It is a city on the move. It consumes staggering quantities of food, water, and animal fodder every single day. Ottoman military planning accounted for this: supply trains, foraging parties, requisitioning from local populations. The system was efficient. Battle-tested. It had sustained armies across thousands of miles of campaign. But the system depended on one assumption, that there would be something to take. Remove that assumption, and the machine starts eating itself. By the 3rd day of the advance, Ottoman supply officers were filing reports that used words like insufficient and critical. By the 5th day, horses were weakening. Cavalry mounts that had been bred for endurance were stumbling on empty stomachs. The animals needed grain and grass. There was no grain. The grass had been burned. By the 7th day, soldiers were slaughtering their own pack animals for meat. Drinking from stagnant pools that hadn't been poisoned only because they were already breeding disease. Dysentery began moving through the ranks. Quietly at first. Then not quietly at all. The June heat made everything worse. The Wallachian plain in summer is a furnace. Flat. Exposed. No shade. Temperatures that crack dry earth and bake men inside their armor. Soldiers who had marched triumphantly through the streets of Constantinople 9 years earlier, men who had felt the exhilaration of the greatest military victory in Ottoman history, now stumbled across a landscape that offered nothing except heat, thirst, and the acrid smell of burned fields stretching to every horizon. And then, once the hunger and the heat and the dysentery had softened the army's body, Vlad went to work on its mind. The night started small. A sentry found dead at his post. Throat opened in a single clean cut. The men sleeping 10 feet away heard nothing. Saw nothing. Woke up to find their guard cold on the ground and no sign of who had done it. A supply wagon discovered at dawn. Its contents burned. Its guards missing. Not dead, missing. No bodies. No blood trail. Just empty space where 4 armed men had been standing 6 hours earlier. Horses with their hamstrings slashed. Screaming in the dark. Thrashing on the ground in agony while the camp lurched awake and soldiers grabbed weapons and stared into blackness that stared back and offered nothing. These were probes. Tests. Vlad was reading the Ottoman camp's responses the way a hunter reads animal tracks. Measuring reaction times. Identifying weak points in the perimeter. Mapping the patterns of sentry rotation. Then, once he had what he needed, he escalated. Vlad's raiders struck in groups of 50 to 200. Fast. Mounted on horses that knew the terrain because they had been raised on it. Every man in these units had grown up within 20 miles of where he was fighting. They knew every ravine. Every tree line. Every dry streambed that could hide a column of riders. They came after midnight. Always after midnight. When exhaustion was deepest. When sentries' eyes were heaviest. When the human body's defenses are at their lowest biological point. They hit the edges of the camp. Killed whoever they could reach in the first 60 seconds. Set fires. Drove off livestock. Destroyed supply wagons, always the supply wagons, with ruthless and absolute priority. Then they vanished. Back into the dark. Back into terrain they could navigate blindfolded. The entire attack, from first contact to withdrawal, lasted minutes. By the time Ottoman officers organized a response, the raiders were gone. The only evidence they left behind was damage. Bodies. Burning wagons. Terrified horses. And the knowledge that it would happen again tomorrow night. And the night after. And the night after that. The Janissaries tried to solve the problem. They established wider perimeters. Posted more sentries. Organized rapid response cavalry units positioned at the camp's edges, saddled and ready. It didn't work. The camp was too large, miles across when 90,000 men bedded down with their equipment and animals. You can't build a wall around a city-sized camp in hostile territory with men who haven't eaten properly in a week. The perimeter had gaps. Vlad found every single one of them. Ottoman cavalry pursued the raiders into the forests. The forests belonged to Vlad. Pursuit parties rode into ambushes laid hours in advance. Into deadfalls, trenches covered with brush that swallowed horses and riders. Into narrow valleys where arrows came from the ridgelines above and the trees were so thick that formation riding was impossible. Ottoman cavalry was designed for open field charges. In these forests, their advantages evaporated. Their heavy horses stumbled on roots and slopes. Their formations broke apart on trails barely wide enough for a single rider. Few pursuit parties returned intact. Some didn't return at all. The men who did come back brought stories that were worse than casualties. Stories about shadows that moved between trees. About arrows that came from nowhere. About sounds in the dark, sounds that might have been animal, might have been human, and might have been something else entirely. Sleep became the rarest commodity in the Ottoman camp. More valuable than food. More precious than water. Because at least hunger and thirst killed you slowly. The raids killed you in your sleep. One moment you were unconscious. The next moment you were dead. Or the man next to you was dead. Or the supply wagon you were guarding was on fire and dark shapes on horseback were pouring through the gap in the perimeter and there were screams everywhere and you couldn't tell which direction to face because the attack was coming from 3 directions at once and by the time you got your sword in your hand it was over and the riders were gone and you were standing in the dark surrounded by dead men and burning grain. Soldiers who had survived the siege of Constantinople, men who had held steady against Greek fire, against desperate counterattacks from defenders who knew they were fighting for their civilization, now flinched at the snap of a twig. Fires were kept burning all night, ringed around the camp in concentric circles, but the light didn't help. It just sharpened the darkness beyond it. Turned every shadow into a shape. Every shape into a threat. Rumors spread through the ranks the way dysentery spread through the water supply, fast, unstoppable, and poisonous. Vlad was a demon. He could see in the dark. He couldn't be killed by mortal weapons. His men were not men at all but strigoi, the undead of Romanian folklore. Corpses that rose from their graves after midnight to drink the blood of the living. 500 years later, these rumors would reach an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker. He would borrow the name Dracula. Build a fictional vampire around it. The legend would outlive the history. But in June of 1462, on the Wallachian plain, surrounded by burned fields and empty villages and the bodies of men killed in their sleep, the legend wasn't fiction. It was operational. If you're still watching, you already understand this isn't a normal war story. This is something else. Drop a comment right now, what would you have done if you were Mehmed? Because what comes next is the moment that almost changed the course of history forever. Here's the thing about what Vlad was doing. Every raid. Every burned wagon. Every throat cut in the dark. None of it was designed to win the war. You cannot defeat 90,000 men with guerrilla raids. The math doesn't allow it. Kill 200 a night, and it takes over a year to grind them down, assuming they stand still and let you do it. Vlad wasn't trying to destroy the army. He was softening it. Weakening it the way water weakens stone. Not by force. By persistence. Night after night after night. Stripping away food, sleep, confidence, and the basic human sense of safety that an army needs to function. He was preparing the Ottoman force for something specific. A single night. A single strike. Something so reckless that when he described it to his commanders, they told him it was suicide. 10,000 men. Against 90,000. In total darkness. Not to defeat the army. To cut off its head. One target. One man. Kill the Sultan, and the war is over. Kill the Sultan, and the succession crisis paralyzes the empire for a decade. Kill the Sultan, and Wallachia survives. His commanders argued against it. The numbers were impossible. Even with surprise. Even at night. Even against an exhausted, demoralized enemy. The Janissary Guard alone outnumbered Vlad's entire strike force. Getting within 100 yards of Mehmed's tent would require punching through the most disciplined soldiers on earth. Vlad listened to every objection. Then he asked one question. What happens if we don't? Silence. He answered it himself. Mehmed takes Târgoviște. Radu sits on the throne. The Devshirme resumes. Within a generation, Wallachian boys are taken south and come back as Janissaries who don't remember their mothers' names. Their faith erased. Their language replaced. Their identity dissolved into the empire like every other nation that chose survival over resistance. He had watched it happen to his own brother. He would not watch it happen to his country. The night of June 17, 1462, was moonless. The darkness was total. And 10,000 men began moving down a forested ridge toward the largest military camp in the world. But what happened next, what unfolded between midnight and dawn on that ridge south of Târgoviște, belongs in its own chapter. Because the distance between Vlad's sword and the Sultan's throat would be measured not in miles. In meters. The Ottoman army made camp on the evening of June 16 in a broad valley south of Târgoviște. The capital was close. 1 day's march. Maybe less. Despite everything, the starvation, the dysentery, the raids, the sleepless nights, the slow hemorrhaging of men and morale, Mehmed intended to take it the following morning. He was Mehmed the Conqueror. He had not crossed the Danube with the largest army in Ottoman history to be chased home by a provincial warlord with a fraction of his numbers. Pride was not vanity for a sultan. It was structural. The empire held together because its ruler never flinched. The moment a sultan retreated from a weaker enemy, every vassal from the Adriatic to the Euphrates would start recalculating their loyalty. So the army camped. Standard Ottoman configuration. The Sultan's tent at the center, silk, enormous, ringed with torches. Around it, the Janissary guard. The inner ring. The men who slept with weapons in their hands and woke at a whisper. Beyond them, the regular infantry. Then the cavalry. Then, at the outermost edges, the supply train and the irregular troops, the azabs, the auxiliaries, the men who were always the first to die when Vlad's riders came out of the dark. 90,000 men settling into what passed for rest. Sentries doubled. Fires burning in concentric rings that turned the valley floor into a constellation of orange light. Every precaution taken. Every lesson from the previous 2 weeks applied. It would not be enough. 3 miles to the northwest, on a forested ridge that overlooked the valley, Vlad crouched among the trees with his commanders. Below them, the Ottoman camp spread across the valley like a city that had sprung up overnight. Thousands of fires. The distant sound of voices, horses, metal. From this height, the scale was staggering. Even for men who had spent weeks fighting this army, seeing it laid out in its entirety, the sheer physical mass of 90,000 human beings and all their equipment concentrated in a single space, was enough to hollow the courage out of a man's chest. Vlad studied the layout. He had sent scouts down the ridge hours earlier. Men who moved through forests the way fish move through water, silent, instinctive, invisible. They had mapped the camp's perimeter. Identified the gaps in the sentry lines. Located the Janissary cordon around the Sultan's position. Estimated distances. Timed the rotation of the guard. The intelligence was as good as it was going to get. The plan was as ready as it would ever be. His commanders did not agree with the plan. They had argued for hours. Some had argued for days. The objections were not cowardly. They were mathematical. 10,000 against 90,000. Even with total surprise. Even at night. Even against men who hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks. The ratio was 9-1. In military history, those odds produce one outcome. Annihilation of the smaller force. And the target made it worse. Vlad wasn't proposing a raid on the perimeter, the kind of hit-and-run strike they had executed successfully for weeks. He was proposing a full cavalry assault straight through the center of the camp. Past the irregular troops. Past the infantry. past the cavalry lines, all the way to the Janissary cordon at the heart. To kill Mehmed. One of his commanders, the sources don't preserve the name, reportedly said 3 words. Asterisk, we will die. Asterisk. Vlad's response has survived in multiple accounts, and while the exact phrasing varies, the substance does not. He did not argue tactics. He did not promise victory. He talked about what would happen if they stayed on the ridge and did nothing. Mehmed takes Târgoviște tomorrow. Radu, Vlad's own brother, the boy who became Ottoman, sits on the Wallachian throne by the end of the week. The Devshirm resumes within the year. Boys taken from their families. Converted. Trained to kill the people they were born to. Daughters absorbed into Ottoman households. The Orthodox Church reduced to a tolerated relic. The Wallachian language diluted. The identity dissolved. Not in a decade. Not in a century. In a single generation. He had watched it happen from inside. He had watched it happen to his own blood. And he told his commanders, these men who had fought beside him for years, who had helped him seize and hold the throne, who had burned their own villages on his orders and driven their own families into the mountains, that there were only 2 options on this ridge tonight. Ride down and try to kill the Sultan. Or ride home and watch your country disappear. One by one, they stopped arguing. The preparation began at midnight. 10,000 men. Horses' hooves wrapped in strips of cloth to muffle the sound on rocky ground. Weapons bound tight against armor and saddles, no metal clinking against metal. Torches carried unlit. No talking above a whisper. No commands shouted. They moved down the ridge in columns, following paths through the forest that most of them had known since they were boys. Hunting trails. Shepherd routes. Paths worn into the earth by generations of men who had walked these same woods for purposes far more ordinary than this. Deer. Boar. Firewood. Now those paths led to the most desperate military gamble in Wallachian history. The descent took 2 hours. 2 hours of near-total silence in near-total darkness. The only sounds were the soft thud of wrapped hooves on earth, the occasional snort of a horse, the breathing of men who understood that the next few hours would decide whether they lived or died. Whether their country lived or died. They reached the tree line at the edge of the valley. Beyond it, the Ottoman camp glowed. Fires. Torches. The silhouettes of tents stretching in every direction. The smell of smoke, of human waste, of 90,000 bodies packed into a space that nature never intended to hold them. Vlad split his force into 3 columns. Left. Right. Center. The flanking columns would strike the camp's edges simultaneously, creating chaos, drawing attention outward, pulling the Ottoman response toward the periphery. The center column, Vlad's column, the largest, carrying the best riders and the hardest fighters, would drive straight for the heart. For the Janissaries. For Mehmed's tent. For the one man whose death could end this war in a single stroke. The columns moved into position. Minutes passed. The fires in the camp guttered and shifted. Somewhere in the Ottoman lines, a horse whinnied. A dog barked. The ordinary sounds of a sleeping army. Sounds that would not be ordinary for much longer. On the ridgeline behind them, a single torch ignited. A pinpoint of orange against the black tree line. Then another. Then another. Then hundreds. The Wallachian cavalry erupted from the tree line on 3 sides at once. There was no gradual build. No warning. One moment the forest edge was dark and silent. The next, it vomited riders. Hundreds of them. Then thousands. Horses at full gallop, riders screaming war cries in Romanian, torches arcing through the air and landing on canvas tents that caught fire like paper. The outer perimeter disintegrated. The irregular troops camped at the edges, azabs, auxiliaries, the least disciplined units positioned furthest from the Sultan, had no chance. They were hit while sleeping. While stumbling to their feet. While groping in the dark for weapons that weren't where they'd left them because panicked horses had already stampeded through their lines, smashing equipment, trampling bodies, dragging tent ropes and supply crates through the chaos. The noise was beyond anything these men had experienced. And these were men who had experienced war. The crash of steel. The roar of spreading fire. The screaming, horses and humans together, a sound that doesn't separate into its components, that hits the ear as a single wall of agony. War cries in a language the Ottoman soldiers didn't understand, coming from every direction at once, making it impossible to determine where the attack was concentrated, where the line was holding, where help was needed. Ottoman soldiers poured out of their tents into a world that had stopped making sense. Firelight through shadows that leaped and twisted. Riders appeared and disappeared. Shapes in the dark that might be friendly, might be enemy, impossible to tell. Men swung swords at movement and hit their own comrades. Officers shouted orders that were swallowed by the noise before they traveled 10 feet. This was what Vlad wanted. Not a battle. Chaos. Pure, undiluted, unmanageable chaos. Because in chaos, numbers don't matter. Training doesn't matter. Discipline doesn't matter. The only advantage that matters is knowing what you came to do, and in that burning, screaming valley, only one side knew. Vlad rode with the center column. He was at the front. Not behind his men. Not directing from safety. At the front. Identifiable by his banner, the dragon standard of his father's house, and by his position and by the way he fought. Sources on both sides, Wallachian chronicles and Ottoman accounts, agree on this detail with unusual consistency. Vlad led from the front. Always. The center column punched through the outer camp like a spear through cloth. The disorganized resistance at the perimeter cost them minutes, not momentum. They drove inward. Past burning tents. Past scattered clusters of Ottoman soldiers who were still trying to form up. Past dead men and dying horses and supply wagons that had become bonfires. The column didn't stop to fight. Didn't stop to secure ground. Didn't stop for anything. They were an arrow. And the target was ahead. The Janissary cordon materialized out of the fire-lit chaos like a wall appearing in fog. And it was a wall. Even now, roused from sleep, armor buckled in haste, operating on instinct and training rather than clear orders, the Janissaries had formed their defensive square around the Sultan's position. This is what they were made for. This exact scenario. Chaos. Darkness. An enemy at the gates. Every year of training, every hour of drill, every layer of discipline beaten into them since they were boys taken from Christian villages, all of it existed for this moment. Protect the Sultan. Hold the line. Die if necessary. Die willingly. Die without retreating a single step. Mehmed was inside the square. Dragged from his tent by his personal guard. Armor buckled over sleeping clothes. Sword in hand. Surrounded by a wall of men whose entire purpose, whose entire identity, was to stand between their sovereign and death. Vlad's cavalry hit the Janissary formation at full speed. The impact was catastrophic. For both sides. Horses crashed into a line of men braced for the collision. Riders flew from saddles. Janissaries were knocked flat, trampled, crushed. But the line held. Bent. Buckled. Absorbed the shock. And held. Men fought at arm's length. Swords. Axes. Daggers when the press was too tight for longer blades. The firelight turned everything to orange and black, faces, blades, blood, all the same color. Men grappled on the ground. Horses reared and came down on bodies. The noise was no longer war. It was something older. Something from before language. Vlad himself, the accounts converge on this, Ottoman and Wallachian, came close. Close enough that the distance between his sword and Mehmed's throat was measured in meters. Not miles. Not the length of a battlefield. Meters. Later historians would debate exactly how close. Some Ottoman sources suggest Vlad's column penetrated to within 2 or 3 tent lengths of the Sultan's position. Others say closer. What no one disputes is that for a span of minutes, 5, 10, perhaps less, the fate of the Ottoman Empire balanced on the edge of a Wallachian sword in the hands of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. But the Janissaries held. They held because holding was what they were. Not what they did. What they were. Their identity had been built for this. Their families taken. Their names erased. Their faith replaced. Everything stripped away except loyalty and the ability to stand in a line and refuse to break. The machine that Vlad hated. The system that had swallowed his brother. The process that turned Christian boys into Islamic soldiers. It saved the Sultan's life that night. The empire's greatest weapon, a weapon forged from the children of conquered peoples, performed exactly as designed. At the worst possible moment, in the worst possible conditions, it did not fail. There is an irony there so bitter it doesn't need commentary. Vlad had turned his own country into a graveyard. Had sacrificed prisoners, collaborators, merchants, had violated every convention of war, every code of conduct between rulers, every limit that separated warfare from something else entirely, to deliver a single message to a single man standing at the edge of a field of rotting corpses. You can have this land. But this is all you will find in it. Mehmed gave the order that evening. Withdraw south. He framed it the way a sultan must frame it. Strategic repositioning. Objectives achieved. A loyal voivode, Radu, the cooperative brother, the boy who became Ottoman, would be installed to administer the province. The campaign was a success. No one called it a retreat. No one had to. Every man in that column knew what it was. The greatest army in the world turned around and marched home. Vlad had won. Or rather, he had not lost. Against the Ottoman Empire in the summer of 1462, that distinction was itself a miracle. But here's the part that doesn't fit in a triumph. The cost. Wallachia was destroyed. Its fields burned. Its villages ash. Its population scattered through forests and mountains, surviving on whatever they had carried on their backs. The economy would take years to recover. The political ground was already crumbling. Radu, backed by Ottoman troops and supported by exhausted boyars who wanted peace at any price, claimed the throne within months. The same nobles Vlad had terrorized into obedience now opened their gates to his brother without a fight. Vlad fled north. To Hungary. To King Matthias Corvinus, the ally who had never come, who had never sent a single soldier across the Carpathians. Matthias didn't welcome him as a hero. He imprisoned him. On fabricated charges. For 12 years. 12 years in a Hungarian cell. A caged dragon. Watching from behind stone walls as Wallachia bent once more under Ottoman control. As the Devshirm resumed. As the slow grinding he had fought to prevent continued without him. He regained the throne briefly in 1476. He was dead within weeks. Killed near Bucharest. The circumstances remain disputed 5 centuries later. Assassinated by his own boyars, some sources say. Killed in battle against an Ottoman detachment, say others. Betrayed by men he trusted, say most. His head was cut from his body. Sent to Constantinople. Mehmed, older now, his health failing, but still the conqueror, reportedly had it displayed on a stake outside the palace. A man who had made impalement his signature. Impaled in death by the empire he had defied. The West remembered him as a monster. German pamphlets, some of the earliest products of the printing press, circulated woodcuts of a mustachioed prince dining among forests of the impaled. Dipping bread in their blood. These images traveled across Europe, growing more grotesque with each reprinting, until the historical Vlad vanished beneath layers of horror fiction. Centuries later, Bram Stoker borrowed the name Dracula and completed the transformation. A man became a myth. A ruler became a vampire. The history dissolved into legend. But in Romania, the memory survived differently. Not comfortably. Not without deep ambivalence. The impalement of prisoners was not propaganda. It was documented by allies and enemies alike. His domestic brutality was real. His methods were indefensible by any moral framework, then or now. And yet, in the summer of 1462, when every other Christian principality in southeastern Europe was submitting, negotiating, or collapsing, one man refused. He did it without allies. Without resources. Without the righteous armor of a noble cause. He did it with fire and darkness and horror. With the weapons of nightmare turned against the architects of empire. He made the Ottomans afraid. Not of losing a battle. Of winning a war. He showed them a victory that would cost more than defeat. A conquest that would consume the conqueror. If this story changed something in the way you understand power, the way you understand what one person can do when every calculation says they should surrender, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't. Because the next story on this channel goes even deeper into the history they never taught you. And it's one you won't find in any textbook. Empires are built on one assumption. That resistance is finite. That any people, pressed hard enough, will submit. Vlad shattered that assumption. He proved that a ruler willing to sacrifice everything, including his own humanity, could make conquest more expensive than retreat. It was not a lesson in courage. It was a lesson in cost. The Danube still flows between the lands of the former empire and the hills of what was once Wallachia. The forests still stand. Thicker now. Older. Their roots tangled with the bones of centuries. And somewhere in the Romanian earth, in an unmarked grave, in a monastery crypt, in a place history has long forgotten, lie the remains of a man who understood something that conquerors never want to hear. Fear is not a monopoly. It can change hands. On the night of June 17, 1462, it did. The empire marched home. The forest remembered.